When we picture ancient Egypt, our brains tend to just throw hieroglyphs, pharaohs, and pyramids into one big bucket. It all just feels like the distant past. But today, we're going to break down a timeline that proves history is vastly deeper than our intuition usually allows. And it all starts with a mathematical reality that completely short-circuits how we look at the ancient world. Because the math on our timeline really doesn't lie. The chronological gap between the pyramids being built and Cleopatra's reign is massively larger than the gap between her and the moon landing. Think about it. The Great Pyramid of Giza was finished around 2560 BCE. Cleopatra died in 30 BCE. That is a stretch of over 2,500 years. Now, compare that to the time between Cleopatra's death and Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon in 1969. That's just under 2,000 years. It's kind of weird to wrap your head around, right? Cleopatra actually lived roughly half a millennium closer to the era of spaceflight, iPhones, and the internet than she did to the construction of Khufu's tomb. Just let that sink in for a second. The architects who built the Great Pyramid are 500 years further away from Cleopatra than she is from us. To really get a feel for how wild this is, we're going to walk down this timeline linearly, starting way back in 2560 BCE. The Old Kingdom, which is often called the Pyramid Age, was an incredibly remote era even to the ancient Egyptians themselves. The state was pouring its entire national economy into building these artificial mountains out of 2.3 million limestone blocks. And the sheer industrial scale of this effort left behind some historical clues that actively confuse us today. What's super interesting here is how early radiocarbon tests made the pyramids look hundreds of years older than our historical records suggested. Back in 1984 and then again in 1994, researchers tested charcoal embedded in the pyramid's mortar. The dates came back totally scattered, sometimes showing the materials were up to 400 years older than Khufu himself. While tests on later Middle Kingdom pyramids were highly accurate, the Great Pyramid samples were just all over the place. The culprit here is something called the old wood problem. This whole pyramid building operation was so heavily industrial that workers completely deforested the local area. They had to bake bread for tens of thousands of workers, smelt copper, and burn vast amounts of gypsum to make mortar. To keep those massive kilns running, they had to scavenge centuries-old deadwood or recycle old settlement timber. So when we carbonate the mortar, we aren't actually dating the pyramid, we're dating trees that died centuries before Khufu was even born. Plus, honestly, the only reason the Great Pyramid even survived the 2,500 years to make it to Cleopatra's era comes down to a really lucky geographic quirk. The pyramid naturally vibrates at a totally different frequency than the bedrock underneath it. Because they don't match, earthquakes don't amplify the shaking. If they had matched, centuries of seismic energy would have compounded, and earthquakes would have torn the structure down block by block long before the Hellenistic era. As centuries dragged on, those towering pyramids basically turned into giant billboards for tomb robbers. It got so bad that later pharaohs had to completely give up the practice and hide their dead in secret mountain valleys instead. By the time of the New Kingdom, the state just couldn't afford to build artificial mountains anymore, and they were terrible at guarding treasure anyway. So they co-opted the natural geology of the Valley of the Kings, cutting hidden, subterranean complexes into the cliffs to securely merge their mortuary cults with the landscape. You can literally track the immense passage of time just by looking at how drastically the Egyptian language mutated and evolved over 3,000 years. The Old Egyptian spoken by Khufu's architects was structurally unrecognizable to the people living thousands of years later. By the time we hit the Ptolemaic era, you've got a society dealing in Demotic for daily life, classical hieroglyphs for the priests, and Greek for the royal administration. So that brings us to Cleopatra's cosmopolitan world. If we fast forward past dozens of dynasties, the collapse of the Old Kingdom, invasions by the Hyksos, the Persian conquests, and total civilizational reboots, by the time we reach Cleopatra, the world of those original pyramid builders was entirely gone. She wasn't some ancient, isolated relic. She was a highly educated, multilingual politician focused on Mediterranean geopolitics and striking deals with Rome. Born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was set up by one of Alexander the Great's generals, Cleopatra was a pure-blooded Macedonian Greek. She ruled from Alexandria, a globalized city with a massive library and lighthouse, managing the existential threat of the expanding Roman Republic. In fact, to the Romans and Greeks of her time, the pyramids were already this completely baffling ancient mystery. Classical writers like Pliny the Elder just brushed them off as giant vanity projects. The classical world knew the pyramids were old, but they had largely lost the context of who actually built them and why. Herodotus even spread rumors that they were funded by a Greek courtesan. To them, the Old Kingdom was as shrouded in myth as antiquity is to us today.
So to Cleopatra and her contemporaries, the Great Pyramid was practically a tourist trap covered in Roman graffiti. Wealthy Romans looking for a getaway would hire chatty local tour guides and take these palatial, multi-story pleasure barges down the Nile. When they arrived at Giza, they literally carved their names into the smooth, white limestone casing stones that still covered the pyramids back then.
Okay, let's shift over to the second half of our timeline and see how this rolls right into the modern era. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire. From there, we cover a 2,000-year stretch leading right up to the Wright brothers in 1903, and then quickly escalating to the Saturn V rocket in 1969. While tech barely crawled forward for thousands of years back in antiquity, the 2,000 years following Cleopatra's death squeezed in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and a moon landing. Between the pyramids and Cleopatra, humanity fundamentally relied on the exact same things: wind, animals, and human labor. But the leap from her era to ours is defined by this absolute explosion of hyper-accelerated progress.
So if the math overwhelmingly proves they're separated by an ocean of time, why do our brains lazily default to throwing the pyramid builders and a Hellenistic queen into the exact same mental folder? Why is it so hard for us to intuitively feel that 2,500-year gap in antiquity, while the 2,000-year gap to our modern era feels so incredibly vast and distinct?
Well, the answer lies in a cognitive psychology glitch called the telescoping effect. It's basically a bias in human memory that takes remote historical events and squishes them closer together, making them feel like they happen roughly around the same time, just because they share a general historical aesthetic.
Because we don't have daily, granular details from 2500 BCE, no photos, no videos, our brains just lack context. So we end up squashing thousands of years together purely on aesthetics. Because the pyramids and Cleopatra are both easily recognizable icons of Egypt, our brains just lazily file them away together.
And this psychological time warping happens all the time. For example, teaching at Oxford University began in 1096, which means it's actually centuries older than the founding of the Aztec Empire. Or think about dinosaurs. The T-Rex lived 85 million years closer to you than it did to a Stegosaurus. We think of Nintendo as super modern, but they are founded in 1889, meaning they coexisted with the Ottoman Empire for over 30 years. It's all about how our brains categorize aesthetics, not actual chronology.
So the big takeaway here is that human history isn't just some compressed diorama of static events. It's a massive, unfolding continuum. And when you realize the ancient Egyptian state lasted longer than our entire current common era, it really leaves you wondering, what other massive chunks of deep time is your brain quietly erasing?
What the fact? Follow for more.